Whoa, hey, your old man's dead. Gee, I'm all torn up by the news.
The Dead to Rights games was a series that passed under my radar when they were first released. Maybe it was because I always found the cover of the first game a bit weird and cheap looking. The games prided themselves on bullet time gameplay, which a lot of games were doing around the same time. After finishing my true crime retrospective, my sights turned to Dead to Rights, a series that was released in a similar time frame and were both third-person shooters where you played as a police officer. So in this video I'm going to take a look at all the games in the Dead to Rights series, to see if I missed out on any gems. The first title in the series was released in 2002 for the Xbox, PS2, GameCube and PC. I'm playing the Xbox version here on a 360, and I'm sure it'd look even better on newer Xbox consoles. Published and developed by Namco, Dead to Rights places you in the shoes of Jack Slate, a police officer who's framed for the murder of his father. It's up to you to escape prison and track down the true culprits. Luckily, you're not alone as you're joined by your trusty police dog Shadow. Your K9 is part of the gameplay. You can use him to one-hit kill enemies and bring their weapons to you, which is handy when you run out of bullets. This attack is on a slowdown timer though, to prevent you from spamming it. There are other segments as well where you control him, such as this bit where you're in a hotel sniffing out bombs, but those are few and far between. The gameplay is the standout aspect of the game. I genuinely had fun playing through. You have basic moves where you can crouch and wall hug to avoid fire, although I didn't use those moves very much. As it was a big trend at the time, you can perform a bullet mode dive, kinda like Max Payne. This comes in useful and isn't as fiddly as you'd expect, much like the human shield mechanic. One downside is you can only fire at enemies your character is facing during a dive. As well as mainly locking onto enemies, you can also free aim, but I didn't find myself doing this often, only really when using sniper to pick off enemies from afar. There are many hand-to-hand combat sections throughout the game. These work okay, but are very basic. There's a punch, kick, dodge and a grab move, and there's also a couple of different combinations you can perform. To spice up the gameplay even more, there's many different mini-games sprinkled throughout the story. There's a rhythm game where you control a stripper, there's many lock-picking and bomb defusal minigames, and there's a few different activities you have to partake in during your prison term, like weightlifting and arm wrestling. It certainly breaks up the gameplay and it'd be a bit of a slog without them. You can tell this game is trying to imitate a blockbuster action movie, with its James Bond style opening credits. The game feels a bit more like a budget action film though, with some so bad it's good cutscenes and some terrible voice acting. Jack Slate's voice actor just sounds bored all the time.
Frank Slate. My dad.
And this guy is trying to do a Christopher Walken impersonation.
What brings you out on a night like tonight? You want to join us? $100 ante.
The environments start out interesting, like this nightclub and Chinese massage parlour, but by the second half of the game you'll be walking down what feels like the same grey corridor over and over again. Something I liked though were these small details here and there, like how your bullet casings fall on the floor, and nice detail in bullet marks on the walls. Overall I enjoy playing through this game, especially since it's backwards compatible with the newer Xbox systems. It doesn't really shine in any particular area, but it's a solid game overall with some nice minigames to break up the gunplay. I do warn you though, it is quite tough. The game received enough favourable reviews to warrant a sequel. A Game Boy Advance spin-off was released in 2004. It's a top-down shooter that retains a lot of the gameplay elements from the console version, but it plays pretty poorly. The game received negative reviews and is often forgot about when looking at the series as a whole. With development duties handed to Widescreen Games, Dead to Rights 2 was released on the PS2, Xbox and PC in 2005. This is the PS2 version that you're watching. The game acts as a prequel where Jack tracks down a kidnapped judge and ends up facing off against different gangs and mobs. It's really basic and boring in terms of the plot. There's a certain charm lost this time around. That doesn't matter too much though, as the gameplay has been refined and improved a lot from the previous game. Running and gunning feels a lot more fluid and easier to perform. Your slow-mo dive works a lot easier as you can aim in any direction while in the air, which is a lot less restrictive than the previous game. Your trusty dog Shadow returns again. He'll take down enemies in real time rather than one-hit kills, and can bring you weapons that are lying on the floor as well as ones being held by enemies. Hand-to-hand combat feels a lot more easier this time. It's pretty much just button mashing without the need to block. One big change this time around is they dropped the minigames, which I quite liked from the previous title. Clearly Jack just didn't have the time for them.
My safe cracking skills were for shit, and I didn't have time for minigames.
While I was disappointed at first, I understand the decision. The gameplay is much faster and fluid this time, and any sort of minigame would have broken that pace down. Environments are a lot more detailed with added destructible objects and scenery to add some extra flair to the game. You can tell that the game was developed with the renderware engine, as everything looks a little nicer with added particle effects too. In terms of audio, I wasn't impressed with the music, far too repetitive, and the gun noises really lack that satisfying punch you get from other shooters. Overall, I enjoyed playing through Dead to Rights 2, probably a little more than the first as its gameplay just works better in general. It can be quite tough in areas, but I didn't get bored with it as it's such a short title and shooting several baddies while in slow motion is rather fun. The game received very average review scores, but this didn't stop a third title in the series from being developed.
Blanchoff will pay for this.
Now, what 6th generation game series would be complete without a PSP spin-off? Serving as a prequel to Dead to Rights 2, Dead to Rights Reckoning was released on the PSP in 2005 in North America and 2006 in Europe. Development duties fell to Rebellion, who worked on a fair few PSP ports at the time, like Gun and Star Wars Battlefront. There's really not that much to say here. It's a handheld version of Dead to Rights. You can still dive in slow-mo, but there are a couple of changes. You can now dive and stay on the ground, which is a nice touch and adds some style. Also, Shadow kills enemies in one hit, very much like the first game. You earn points for kills now, so the game has a slightly more arcade feel to it. Levels are really small and there's no variety at all to the objectives. Just go into a small area and shoot everybody. It's a basic version of an already basic game. The gameplay works, but it just doesn't sustain my attention at all this time. There's a multiplayer mode, but I can't imagine many people would have played this when it was first released, let alone now. As you can imagine, the game received average to poor reviews. Finally, let's take a look at Dead to Rights Retribution. It was released on the Xbox 360 and PS3 in 2010. The game was developed by Volatile Games, which is a division of Blitz Games, a studio founded by the Oliver twins, known for their work on the Dizzy games. The game serves as a reboot for the series. You play as Jack Slate once again with your trusty pal Shadow, who becomes a playable character again. These shadow segments kinda act like stealth levels where you sneak about, taking out enemies quietly and dragging their bodies out of plain sight. You can bark to lure over baddies, and the takedowns look really brutal. Rather being separated like previous games, the hand-to-hand combat and firearm gameplay are mixed together this time. You have many different combos of light and strong attacks with numerous takedowns. The human shield system works a lot better as you can move a lot more quickly while holding an enemy. Fighting is kinda awkward as you can't really lock on to enemies. I was never quite sure whether to fight an opponent or just simply shoot them in the head. Taking cover works slightly better than in previous games, and you will need to use this at times. That being said, it's still really awkward. I ended up diving over the cover rather than crouching behind it. The iconic slow-mo dives are now gone in this title, in favour of a simple slow-mo bar that increases with stylish takedowns. Like many games of the time, Retribution tries to jump on the hype that the Gears of War games created. The The game tries to be even more dark and gritty than before, to a point where it's just laughable.
Tell me, why? My dad is dead!
Your health bar has been replaced by a regenerating one, and the camera seems to shake all over the place. It just makes me want to puke. And unlike the polished Gears of War games, Retribution has numerous bugs and glitches that I encountered. The game received mostly average reviews. It's a generic average title which wasn't as fun as the earlier titles in the series. Looking overall at the series, it's easy to see why I never really picked up these titles when they were first released. They were always in the shadow of more polished and popular titles. Would I recommend any of you play these games? Well, while the second game has good gameplay, I'd pick up a copy of the first title. It's backwards compatible on the newer Xbox consoles, and it's fun in a really cheesy way. It's clear to see why the series ended. It was just too generic in a sea of third-person shooters. If you want a solid game involving bullet time dives, you'd obviously play the Max Payne series. Thank you for watching my retrospective on the Dead to Rights series. Consider subscribing as there's plenty of videos coming this year. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.